Hello there, and welcome to Sleepless Scrolls. You're not imagining it. You're awake, and I'm glad you are. Whether you're curled up in a high-rise in Chicago or half sinking into a blanket fort in Kyoto, I want you to pause just for a moment and breathe. What time is it there? Midnight, 3 a.m. No matter. We're about to begin a journey that'll carry you far from the ticking of your clock and into something older, softer, scented with pine. This isn't just any bedtime story. It's one that'll lull you into sleep by leading you through candlelit hallways and whispering forests, where mystery and medicine met in the most unexpected object, the humble pine cone. Tonight's tale is about why Georgian aristocrats, those powdered, perfumed creatures of silken splendour, kept pine cones beside their beds, not as quaint decoration, not as childhood souvenirs, but as sacred tools of sleep and status. You probably won't survive this if you're hoping for a quick answer, because the truth is layered, like the bark of an old tree, knotted with science, myth, politics, and just a whiff of obsession. So lean back, let your muscles melt, and close your eyes if you like. I'll do the looking for you. You trudge now through a garden, barefoot, the air soaked with dew. It is summer, 1771. A pale mist snakes along the grounds of a sprawling Georgian estate in Gloucestershire. The moon hangs full, watching like a lantern, and ahead, light, flickering through drawn velvet curtains. Inside the manor, someone cannot sleep. You slip through the walls of this place, this world. The rooms smell of lavender, beeswax, and something sharper, brisk, sappy like a forest after rain. Pine. In a four-poster bed trimmed in crimson damask, Lady Elira Grafton lies awake. Her hand drapes over the mattress edge. Her fingers graze a small wooden bowl on her nightstand. Within it, a single pine cone dark and glistening like an eye. She doesn't touch it, she never does, but it's always there, and she is not alone. All across England, in the bedrooms of the rich and restless, pine cones sit silently, next to candles, beside Bibles, beside snuff boxes and combs, some polished, some scorched at the tip, some painted in gold leaf, but always near the pillow, always near the breath, because breath in Georgian times was sacred and dangerous. The 18th century was an age of both opulence and unease. London was gilded in gaslight and lined with sewers. Coaches clattered down cobbled roads while plague still whispered in shadows. For all their powdered wigs and poetic salons, Georgian aristocrats lived in quiet dread of illness, of decay, of the unknowable force they called bad air. Miasma, they said. The theory that sickness came not from germs, then still undiscovered, but from poisoned air. Thick, fetid atmospheres could seep into your lungs and unmake you, molecule by molecule. So the air had to be watched, filtered, manipulated. Enter the pine cone. To you, perhaps it's just something your feet crunch through in the woods, but to them it was more than a forest souvenir. It was a guardian, a botanical knight. Why pine? Because it endured. The pine tree, ancient, evergreen, untamed, was a symbol of vitality. Unlike deciduous trees that withered each winter, pine stayed green through death and frost. The cone, its reproductive crown, held the power of immortality in miniature form. Georgians admired that, coveted it. And then they learned it had a smell. Not a perfume, no. A force. The cone, when warmed by candle or crushed between cloth, released terpenes, aromatic compounds now known to possess antimicrobial properties. Though they didn't have the science for it yet, the Georgians felt it. The sharp, clean tang of pine made the air feel less heavy, less cursed, safer. Some physicians of the time even advised the use of coniferous oils to protect the lungs. Place fresh cones near the nostrils during slumber, one herbalist wrote in 1765, to fend melancholy vapours and mortify all inward corruption. Melancholy in Georgian medical thought was not just sadness, it was illness, spiritual rot. Night was the hour when melancholy was believed to rise from the belly to the brain. So sleep became dangerous, and what you breathe during sleep, even more so. That's where you come in again. You're standing now in a colder bedroom, darker, more severe. It's the chamber of Sir Percival Wren, a retired colonel turned philosopher. You watch him light a taper, blow it out, then bend to whisper a single phrase to the cone beside his bed. Cleanse the hour. This was no superstition. It was habit, ritual, almost religious. Historians still argue whether pine cones were placed beside the bed for health or for holiness. Was it medicinal or metaphysical? A physical air purifier or a symbol of a soul unsoiled? Because here's the twist, the pine cone doesn't just smell, it signifies. In ancient cultures, Assyrian, Greek, even Roman, the pine cone was associated with the third eye, the bridge between realms. Priests once carved it into staffs. Monks painted it above doorways. In Georgian England, with its lingering Christian mysticism, such symbols crept quietly into private practice, never openly pagan, but privately potent. And the Georgian bedroom, you see, was a temple, ornate yet intimate. Decorated, yes, but with meaning. Candles burn not just for light, but for rhythm. Incense for sanctity. And the pine cone? A silent sentinel between the sleeper and the dark. Some ladies slept with sachets sewn with pine needle and bark tucked into their pillowcases. Others insisted on a fresh cone each week, harvested by hand from private groves or imported from the Alps. There were even craftsmen, quiet, exclusive, who polished and sealed pine cones in wax to enhance their scent and prolong their shelf life. These bespoke pieces were tucked inside mahogany drawers like secrets. You might smile. It all feels so quaint, doesn't it? But imagine now your own bedroom, the glow of your screen, the hum of your fan, the little things you keep within reach, a water bottle, a lamp, your phone. Is it so different? Is your glowing rectangle really any less mystical than their crumbling cone? You hear a wind outside, a soft rustle through the Georgian hedgerows. You pass through walls again, into another chamber. This one belongs to a child, sickly, curled beneath quilts. At his side, a nurse. She waves a sachet of crushed pine over his head before laying it by his bed. She does not smile. She is not soothing him. She is protecting him from the night, from breath itself. And still no one quite agrees what it meant. Was the cone a placebo, a psychological crutch for a frightened ache? Or was there something more ancient in its presence? A flicker of memory from older rituals, older wisdom. No one can say for sure, but they kept them there. Always. And tonight, so do you. You linger now at the threshold of another bedroom, larger, warmer, flickering with the amber light of a dying hearth. A walnut dressing table sits quietly in the corner, its surface cluttered with delicate brushes, ivory combs, and vials of rosewater. The mirror reflects not just the room, but the ornate candlelit ceiling. You walk past the tangle of lace and lavender, past the velvet ottoman, and draw closer to the nightstand. There it is again. The pine cone, not hidden this time, centered, elevated on a little silver tray. It has been rubbed with something, oil perhaps, or beeswax, giving it a dark, honeyed sheen that catches the flame. A faint scent trails upward, clean, sharp, and woody. That smell again. Pine. This is the bedroom of Marquis Henrietta Bowl, a noted salon hostess known for her obsession with purity, physical, spiritual, and aesthetic. Her sheets are linen, scrubbed with vinegar and laid in the sun. Her slippers are lined with rosemary. Her chambermaids wear gloves when handling her bedclothes. And the pine cone? That is her nightly companion. To you, a pine cone might seem a curious object to protect such luxury, but to the Georgian elite, the smell of one could whisper 1,000 meanings. The 18th century, particularly among the upper crust of England, was a time of unrelenting self-curation. Your home wasn't just a residence, it was a performance. Bedrooms were private, yes, but not always personal. A guest might still be shown the bedchamber to glimpse your taste in linens, your class through scent. And in that age of overlapping superstition and science, aroma held deep social significance. You see, before the rise of germ theory, the sense of smell was believed to be directly tied to morality, intellect, and even your fate. If you smelled bad, you weren't just unhygienic, you were morally suspect. Odours were seen as more than signs of decay. They were symptoms of spiritual decline. So controlling scent became a form of control over the self. The aristocracy adopted perfumes, potpourris, herbal infusions, anything to guard the body's borders, but few smells were as coveted, or as complex, as that of pine. Why pine? Because it was both exotic and familiar. The British Isles had their own coniferous trees, yes, but the varieties considered fashionable were often alpine or Mediterranean. Pines from Corsica, for example, produced cones with a deeper aroma. Some households went so far as to import cones wrapped in cloth and wax from private European estates. The rarer the scent, the more refined you appeared. And there was something else too. Pine didn't just cover other smells, it cleansed, or so they believed. The Georgian elite, always half in love with the notion of natural order, adored anything that seemed both wild and dignified. The pine cone was perfect, untamed yet symmetrical. Brutal in nature, but gentle by design. The cone's geometry, the Fibonacci swirl of its scales, was a thing of divine elegance to the 18th century eye. Some described it as God's fingerprint, but the smell is what kept it close. In 1759, a London physician named de Lawrence Mortimer wrote a short treatise titled On Night Vapours and Their Arrest. In it he claimed that the sap-bearing cones of alpine firs may, when freshened by oil or warmed near the bed, sterilise the breathways against phlegmatic corruption. While modern medicine has, of course, advanced past such language, the core of Mortimer's belief wasn't entirely wrong. Pine oil does have mild antiseptic properties, and the terpenes it emits can act as a respiratory stimulant. But to the Georgian ear, stimulating the lungs sounded like something closer to a spiritual awakening. And that's exactly what they wanted, an assurance that their sleep, their dreams, and their very air was sanctified. This obsession with scented air gave birth to a strange subculture of aromatic elitism. Entire manuscripts were written on bedroom scents, and the pine cone soon stood as a status object. You weren't simply wealthy if you had a pine cone near your pillow, you were consciously refined. You understood the invisible world, you had good taste in things no one could see. Some aristocrats took the practice further. They employed scenters, young servants whose entire duty was to prepare the room's aroma before bedtime. These attendants would gently heat the pine cone with a cloth dipped in warm oil, sometimes infused with hints of mint or bergamot, and wave it slowly through the bedchamber to season the air. Once cooled, the cone was placed back onto its silver tray, silent, satisfied. You hear footsteps behind you now, soft, slippered, almost hesitant. It's the Dowager Countess of Wexbridge. She walks slowly, her candle bobbing slightly with each step. She murmurs to herself as she approaches the bed. Her fingers trace the outline of the pine cone, not fondly, not superstitiously, but with reverence. This one, you realise, isn't for the air, it's for the memory. Her late husband, the Earl, was obsessed with pine. He had pine panels installed in their drawing room, carried a pinewood cane, slept beside a bowl of dried pine cones for most of their marriage. Even as his mind began to fade, his hand still found its way to the cone at night, as if holding it held him together. When he passed, she kept the last cone, still keeps it, every night. Now you sit with her in the candlelight, in that hush of the hours when only the curtains breathe. You watch her lips part slightly, a whisper, sleep without shadow. That was his phrase. He said it every night before closing his eyes. She says it still, and so the pine cone became more than medicine, more than status. It became a vessel for the dead, a way to hold on to something unspeakable, like a pressed flower from a lost garden. Historians still argue whether pine cones served a religious, aromatic, or psychological role, but perhaps it's the wrong question. Perhaps they served all three and something more. Because this tender attachment, this silent presence on the nightstand doesn't require justification. It only requires belief. and the Georgians believed deeply. Even their poets indulged the pine. In an unpublished letter from 1783, the poet Isadora Kent wrote, "To sleep beside the crown of a tree is to borrow its dream. The cone hears no lies, it watches the breath." Was she being poetic or serious? In Georgian England, those two things often dance together. You rise again, the room fades. Now you walk into a newer house, less ornate, cleaner, starker. The bed is simpler, the nightstand plain, but there, once again, is the pine cone, this time cradled in a carved wooden bowl shaped like a leaf. Some things, it seems, refuse to fade. Even now, centuries later, in attics and estates long abandoned, archaeologists occasionally uncover these pine cones, dusty, intact, beside crumbling bed frames. Some are buried under years of silence, wrapped in faded lace or tucked inside drawers sealed shut since Victoria's reign. Each one was once a breath guardian, a whisper catcher, a bedside sentinel against the dark. And now, as you lie back, perhaps you understand. Not the facts, not the logic, but the feeling. You breathe in, slow, the world narrows. You're a guest now in the past. And the pine cone watches still. You drift now into a room unlike the others. The walls are papered in rich green damask, but the ceiling is lower, the fireplace cold. There is no perfume hanging in the air here, only the raw organic scent of resin and old wood. The space feels more intimate, more personal. You sense you're not meant to be here, and yet something invites you to stay. A single chair, a candle stir, and on the nightstand a pine cone, not polished, not perfumed, but rugged, dark, still cradling flakes of bark. It looks freshly plucked from the wild. This is not the bedroom of a noble lady or an aging countess. This is the private chamber of a botanist. Dr. Elias Grummond. You don't know his name yet, but history will. A recluse by reputation and eccentric by every letter, Grummond had once been the royal court's favoured naturalist, but he left the clamour of court life behind, trading powdered wigs for mossy boots and ballrooms for bogs. His obsession? Pine cones. You draw closer to the papers scattered across his desk. The spidery scrawl reads more like poetry than science. The pine cone, crown of the eternal, fossil of sleep, organ of air, sponge of sorrow. He believed the pine cone wasn't just a seed holder. He called it a porous mirror, capturing more than breath, perhaps even dreams. You lift one of his journals. Inside, a list of names, dates, sleep hours, and dream descriptions. Beside each name, a drawing of a cone, some short and stout, others long and spiral. Each entry follows a pattern: cone type, location in the room, mood before bed, and then the dreams, some pleasant, others terrifying, and always a note about the air. Still, bitter, warm, decay at edge of wind. Grummond was mapping something, an invisible relationship between the pine cone's physical form and the atmosphere of sleep. Mainstream science of the era paid him little attention, but in private drawing rooms, his work became the subject of fascination. Aristocrats, bored with politics and seduction, turned their eyes toward the esoteric, and so the pine cone, humble and silent, ascended yet again in status. But where did these pine cones come from? Not just any forest would do. In Georgian England, imported luxury was the name of the game. Wealth wasn't measured solely in silverware or stables, but in where your goods came from. And in this case, the best pine cones were alpine. Your journey takes you now into the brittle heights of the Swiss Alps, sometime in the 1760s. You find yourself trudging alongside two men in wool cloaks. One carries a sack, the other a walking stick with a carved falcon head. These are collectors, hired by wealthy English families to trek into foreign woods in search of the finest pine cones money could buy. There is no trail, only snow, rock, and towering trees. The men stop beneath a grand Arolla pine. Its cones hang like ornaments, thick, golden brown, coated in sticky resin. They speak little. The older one removes a hooked knife, cuts a cone, wraps it in cloth, and places it in the cedar box. Each cone is harvested with care, not unlike a sacred object. And in truth, that's how they were treated. Back in England, these alpine cones were sold through quiet channels, botanical gardens, private societies, discreet catalogues passed hand to hand in parlours over tea and scandal. A single alpine pine cone could cost the same as a fine waistcoat. The appeal wasn't just the scent or size, it was the story. The idea that this object had been born in wind and snow, that it had endured mountain storms and bitter winters, and now sat beside your bed in perfect stillness. It was resilience, bottled. Some households kept their cones in locked cabinets during the day, only bringing them out at night as part of a bedtime ritual. Others had small stands carved into the headboard of their beds, a place of honour for the cone. It became common among the aristocracy to show off their collection subtly, not with garish display, but with quiet mentions. "Oh, ours is a roller," someone might say at supper. "Corsican, of course," replies another, sipping a delicate cordial. A third chimes in, "We only sleep beside the Serbian black." It sounds absurd now, but back then, in those echoing estates lit by candles and shadowed by superstition, this was social capital. Your pine cone was an extension of your taste, your wealth, even your health philosophy, but not everyone agreed. Historians still argue whether the pine cone's popularity was rooted in actual belief, or merely fashionable mimicry. Was it genuine conviction in pine's purifying properties? Or a game of high society one-upmanship, a scented war of silent prestige? The answer may lie somewhere in between, because while some collected for sport, others collected for sleep. Back in Grumman's journals, we see a strange pattern begin to form. He began documenting not just dreams, but physiological reactions, breath rate, body temperature, mood upon waking. He claimed pine cones near the bed led to deeper, more restful sleep. Of course, there's no empirical data here, just ink and intuition. Still, centuries later, studies on forest bathing and aromatherapy would validate some of these beliefs. The terpenes released by conifers, pinene, limonene, bornyl acetate, do affect the nervous system. They can lower cortisol, slow the heart, even increase alpha brainwave activity associated with calm. Was Grummond wrong, or simply early? You move now into the bedroom of Lord Aldenspire, an insomniac, a poet, a man who in his final years filled 3 entire volumes with nightly pinecone experiments. "Tonight I used the Sardinian," one entry reads. "Slept little, head full of buzzing, switched to Bavarian the next night, dreamt of water, silence and peace." He believed deeply that each species of cone possessed its own personality, its own dream print. And while modern science has dismissed these ideas, something about them lingers. The cone as oracle, the cone as filter, the cone as companion. Now walk with me to the final chamber of this section, the strangest yet. This room belongs to Lady Callista Moore, a widow, a painter, known for keeping a row of 7 pine cones along her mantel, each marked with a day of the week. She claimed the cones aligned her dreams with planetary energies, that Thursday's cone drew wisdom, Saturday's solitude. Did others believe her? Not exactly, but they visited and copied her habit all the same, because by now the pine cone wasn't just aroma, it was mythology. And you, yes, you, are standing in the middle of it. What was once just a piece of forest has become a chambered artifact, a prism through which people filtered fear, hope, health, and dreams. So tonight, as your own nightstand glows faintly with moonlight, and your thoughts begin to slip, imagine this. 1 pine cone, beside your bed, still, watching, whispering through scent, not just guarding your breath, but shaping what you see when your eyes close. You awaken within another space, though awaken may not be the right word. It's softer than waking, heavier than dreaming. You float forward, and the walls shift around you. They aren't made of stone or plaster, they are made of scent. A pine-sweet breath, cool and sharp, carries you through corridors that vanish as soon as you pass them. You are no longer in a bedroom, but in a space of thought, an idea, an age. It is the age of miasma, and you, drifting like a whisper through Georgian air, are about to understand why breath itself was once feared more than blade or beast. The 18th century was a time of beauty and rot. Powdered wigs, stained lace, gilded wallpaper that shimmered even as it peeled from damp walls. Wealthy homes bustled with carriages and candlelight, but they also hosted something unseen, the air. And the air back then was a threat. Miasma theory, now long discredited, was the dominant model of disease for centuries. The theory claimed that illness spread not through contact or particles, but through bad air, night air, corrupted air, rotted air. The invisible vapours from decaying matter, human waste, mould, and even marshes were believed to enter the lungs and poison the blood. Where we now see bacteria and viruses, they saw a curse hanging in the atmosphere. And at night, when the body lay exposed, still defenceless, that's when the air crept in. You find yourself now in the sick room of an estate near Bath. The shutters are drawn. The doctor stands stiffly, face veiled by a damp cloth laced with vinegar. On the mantel sits a bowl of crushed lavender, camphor, and, yes, pine needles. All of it in an attempt to purify what cannot be seen. The patient lies curled beneath a yellowing sheet, breath shallow, skin grey. "Open the pine," the physician says. And so a servant takes a cone, small, sun-baked, and gently cracks it open, releasing its scent into the stale room. No one expects a cure, but perhaps a delay, a pause, a breath free of poison. That is what the pine cone was for, not to heal, but to protect. In Georgian homes, you were never far from scent, not just for comfort, but for survival. Windows were opened wide at midday to refresh the spirit of the house. Vinegar was boiled, herbs were hung in bundles above doors and mantels, pine cones were tucked into corners, sometimes burnt lightly over small flames to activate their odour. To the modern mind, this might feel like superstition, but to them, it was science, or at least the best version of it available. Physicians of the time believed that each part of the body corresponded to a scent. The lungs, naturally, were most sensitive to airborne humours. If the air was clean, the breath was clean. If the air was corrupt, disease would settle in the chest, and from there to the blood, the bowels, and eventually the brain. So every household had its defences, and while rose petals and vinegar were popular among the middle class, pine cones became the preferred protection of the upper crust. Why? Because pine was bold, clean, not cloying like lily, not sugary like clove. It was woodsy, masculine, rational. In Georgian England, to choose pine was to say, "I believe in the world's design." But it wasn't just disease they feared. It was melancholy. Today we'd call it depression, perhaps anxiety, or insomnia. But in the 1700s, melancholy was seen as a vaporous imbalance of the soul, a condition of the spleen, the stomach, the mind. And it was deeply connected to scent. "Let not the sleep hour pass under foul air," wrote apothecary Belinda Wells in a 1778 pamphlet on the gloaming hour, "for the humours of sadness rise most eagerly when breath is drawn in shadow." She too recommended pine, not burned, not brewed, but watched. A pine cone on the nightstand was believed to draw the sadness outward, to siphon the thin blue vapours of gloom from the corners of the room. Some even claimed the cone would close slightly as it absorbed these melancholic mists, a phenomenon now attributed to moisture levels, but back then interpreted as spiritual behaviour. Imagine that, lying in bed, watching the pine cone, waiting for it to shift, listening to your own breath. It sounds mad, and yet, doesn't it also sound familiar? Today we watch our screens, scroll our feeds, we read until the weight of the world lets us rest. Is it really that different? Perhaps the cone was the first nightstand ritual, a bedtime app made of wood and oil. You walk now into a small nursery. The wallpaper is hand-painted with birds. A rocking horse waits in the corner. The bed is tiny, barely larger than a cradle. And beside it, on a shelf carved with stars, sits a pine cone. This is not for aroma, not for health. This is for dreams. Some Georgian families believed that pine cones could shape the dreams of children, that they drew nightmares from the air and held them tight-lipped, sealed between their scales, until morning. One mother wrote to a friend in 1791, "I placed a cone at Thomas's side last eve, and he slept without wailing. Not once did he cry out. I swear the cone is not a toy, it is a guardian." These pine cones were sometimes anointed with oils mixed with crushed opium poppies or valerian root, thought to deepen sleep and sweeten the subconscious. Were the children really calmer? Did the cone make any difference? Historians still argue whether this was placebo, parenting, or pure coincidence, but what matters is this: they believed. And belief, when given a body, becomes ritual, and when rituals repeat, they become culture. The pine cone didn't just exist in bedrooms, it wandered into spiritual spaces. Some clergymen, though wary of pagan overtones, accepted pine cones as tokens of the eternal. They linked to the cone's spiral structure to divine design, the golden ratio that hinted at God's fingerprint. In private churches on noble estates, pine cones appeared as carved ornaments on pew ends, on altar cloths, even etched into the base of silver chalices, but never overtly, never too loud, because religion was cautious, and pine cones, ancient symbols of fertility, immortality, and third-eye consciousness, had histories far older than Christendom. Still there were whispers that the pine cone kept near the head during sleep opened the mind to divine visions, that it was the key to prophecy, that the dreams it allowed were glimpses of the soul between worlds. You lie in one such room now, low-ceilinged, cloister quiet. A nun sleeps on a straw mattress, her hands rest on her chest, folded in prayer, and on the stone windowsill beside her, a pine cone, its scales worn smooth by decades of touch. No perfume, no oil, no polish, just presence, and that is enough. Return now to the homes we began with, to Lady Elira, to Dr. Grummond, to the children's nurseries and candlelit deathbeds. You see the same object, so simple, so still, playing different roles. A medicine, a protector, a dream catcher, a theological cipher. That is the genius of the pine cone. It is always the same, only the meaning changes. Tonight your breath deepens. You're in your bed, now, here, but in some ways, you're also in 1772. Your room smells clean, calm. You've turned off the screens, the world narrows, and in the corner of your vision, whether truly or in memory, you see it. Small, brown, ancient, still holding its scent, still catching your breath, still listening, still watching. You return now to a world where the lines between medicine and magic blur like breath on cold glass. The miasma theory may dominate the thinking of the age, but its hold is not unchallenged. In drawing rooms and over claret-soaked suppers, ideas shift, opinions spark and clash, and amid the swirl of speculation, one belief remains evergreen, quite literally: the pine cone. Its presence beside the bed has become nearly ubiquitous among the upper class, but few agree on why it's there. You step through the quiet doorway of a salon in London's Mayfair district. The walls are velvet-clad. A mirror above the hearth reflects the trembling light of 20 candles. It is late, past midnight, but the air is electric. A gathering is underway. Poets, physicians, skeptics, seekers. They sit on mismatched chairs, lounging with a casual elegance unique to the well-bred and well-bored. A woman in midnight blue silk leans forward. "Tell me again, Mr. Selwyn," she says, "why your pine cone smells more honest than mine." He smiles, tapping ash from his cheroot. It's Corsican, picked by monks no less. It's not the scent, it's the sanctity, laughter. But beneath the amusement lies tension. For every gentleman who treats pine cones as aristocratic amusement, there is another who so swears by them, who claims their dreams are calmer, their breath clearer, their sleep longer, when the cone rests within arm's reach. One doctor, lean and severe in his powdered wig, clears his throat. "We must be careful," he says. "We are indulging sentiment. The cone is no priest." A reply comes swiftly from a younger man, more romantically dressed. "Nor is it mere wood. It lives, it breathes, albeit differently than we. Would you question a tree's silence?" A pause. You notice now that in the centre of the room, under a crystal cloche, rests a pine cone. Perfectly symmetrical, slightly opened. The guests have each brought a cone of their own. They place them gently around the base like offerings. Tonight's subject is serious. The question, is the pine cone medicinal, spiritual, or a delusion wrapped in perfume? And you, quiet observer, breath steady in the soft dark, watch as each person wrestles with this seemingly simple object. Among the learned, debates rage. While physicians appeal to respiratory theory and aristocratic botanists to natural symmetry, others reach backward into deeper myths. You follow a thread now, from London to the countryside into a modest parish library in Wiltshire. The vicar is elderly, half-blind, but his memory is intact. He flips through a brittle volume, a translation of a Roman naturalist's notes on pine cones and their ceremonial use in ancient rites. "Pine cones," he says softly, "have long been guardians of transition. Between sleep and waking, life and death, this world and whatever lies behind it." He leans closer. "They were hung in the homes of the dying, buried in the graves of warriors, pressed into the hands of new mothers. You see it then, this object we've followed through pillows and perfume trays was once and perhaps always a threshold. The ancient Egyptians painted pine-like patterns on temple walls. The Greeks carved them onto staffs held by Dionysian priests. The Assyrians in their reliefs showed winged beings holding cones like keys. To open gates, to awaken the third eye, to cleanse the soul. The pine cone in its layered spiral resembled the human pineal gland, a symbol of sight beyond sight. Historians still argue whether Georgian elites knew this, whether their use of the cone was a deliberate echo of ancient symbology or merely aesthetic coincidence. But if the past has a scent, it lingers here in the Georgian chamber, in the modern eye, in the breath of belief. You drift now into another space, smaller, simpler, but no less reverent. It is the bedroom of a governess, not noble but educated. Her belongings are modest, a pewter comb, a leather-bound Bible, a cup of cold tea, but on her nightstand sits a pine cone. She cannot afford alpine imports. Hers was gathered during a walk near the estate where she works, but she treats it no differently than Lady Grafton treats her gold-leafed cone. Each night the governess writes in a small journal, her day's lessons, her aches, her hopes, and always she ends with a note on her dreams. Dreamt of a corridor made of light. My mother was there behind a door made of air. The cone remained closed. Her cone too watches. Her cone too bears witness. This object, once reserved for upper echelons, has begun to trickle downward. Not by decree, but by mimicry. What the gentry embrace, the literate classes imitate, albeit in a humbler form. And in this governess's room you sense no pretension, no performance, only a quiet faith that sleep shaped by pine-scented air might be safer than waking. You are now in a merchant's townhouse in Bristol. The master is away, trading goods along the coast. His wife is alone tonight. She's placed a pine cone on the mantel, thick, short, uneven. She didn't buy it. Her youngest son brought it back from a walk. "For your dreams, mamma," he said. She smiled, but inwardly dismissed it as childish. But tonight, the house is creaking strangely. The wind hisses at the windows. She lies in bed, thinking of ships and storms and sickness. She cannot sleep. Her eyes keep drifting to the pine cone. It rests quietly in the dark, catching a sliver of moonlight. After a moment she rises, takes the cone, and places it beside her pillow. She does not know why, but when she finally sleeps, her dreams are still. Across the sea, in the colonies, pine cones hold different meanings. Among indigenous tribes, pine is sacred. healing, a connection to earth and spirit. Colonial settlers begin to notice this, and some adopt pine into their own nocturnal rituals, bringing with them the customs of home. The pine cone becomes a migrant object, travelling across oceans, bridging continents. In Canada, cones are used as poultices. In India, British officers build estates and hill stations surrounded by Himalayan pine forests, convinced the air keeps them from going native. In the Caribbean, pine oil is mixed with lime and used to scrub walls, both for scent and for the illusion of control, but it always returns to the nightstand, that intimate altar where breath becomes belief. Now you find yourself within the mind of a scholar, not of the 1700s, but today. She sits cross-legged in a library, reading by lamplight, sifting through papers about this curious pine cone tradition. Her notes scatter across the table. Psychosomatic comfort, connection to natural rhythms, fragrance memory associations. She is sceptical. She is also drawn in. At night, in her apartment, she places a pine cone on her desk, just to observe it. By the third night it moves beside her bed. By the seventh she notes her dreams feel slower, less chaotic, weighted in a peaceful way. She laughs at herself, but she does not move the cone, because maybe, just maybe, there's something about this ritual, this presence that science cannot quantify. And so you return once more to the hush of the Georgian bedroom. The air is warm. A candle gutters low. The pine cone sits where it always has, quiet and immutable, like a forest relic slipped through the veil of sleep. It has no voice, no answers, but it has witnessed all your breath, all your dreams, all the unspoken fears of a world where air once meant death and sleep was not always safe. Now it simply waits, like it always does, watching, breathing, listening with you. The house you now enter is silent in a peculiar way, not the stillness of sleep nor the breathless pause of prayer, but something else entirely. It is the stillness of study, of held thoughts and unspoken questions. Dust motes float in slanted golden shafts from the windows. Shelves line the walls, not with books but with jars, hundreds of them, each containing a pine cone. Some sealed in wax, some suspended in oil, others dried and cracked like ancient fossils. Labels scrawled in ink. Scots pine, 1774. Austrian black, 1791. Corsican cluster, unknown origin. This is the home of Professor Erastus Fenn, natural philosopher and amateur sleep anatomist. He does not believe in dreams, not in the way poets or priests do. He believes in sleep architecture, though he does not yet have the language for it. He speaks of stages, of depths, of rhythms in the body's unconscious retreat from the world. His obsession, how the environment shapes these rhythms. You walk with him now down narrow aisles between tables covered in sketches and dried plant matter. He does not greet you. He is mid-experiment, whispering notes under his breath. Subject 8 reported olfactory hallucination. Resin notes triggered memory of storm in Devonshire. Pulse lowered. No waking events recorded. Fenn believes that the pine cone isn't just passive. He believes it modifies the mental state of the sleeper, not chemically, not spiritually, but acoustically and aromatically. The cone, he says, is a silent soundboard, and in a way he might be right. Recent science suggests that humans react even in deep sleep to subtle environmental cues, sounds, scents, temperatures. Pine, with its volatile oils and resinous compounds, is among the strongest natural olfactory triggers. Even without conscious thought, the scent is interpreted by the brain as clean, alert, safe. The body reacts accordingly. Heart rate slows, cortisol drops, breath deepens. Fenn, ahead of his time, intuits all of this. He creates a device, an open wooden frame designed to hold a cone 6 inches from the face of the sleeper. He calls it the nocturnal lull, and he insists it improves the quality of dreams. He tests it on himself. Each morning he writes down his dreams in tight, controlled cursive. By the 15th day the pages soften. He begins writing poetry, strange spiralling verses filled with images of forests, stars, and breath. He doesn't even notice the change. But others do. By the 40th day, he stops recording entirely. He simply sits at his desk, cone in hand, smiling faintly, eyes half closed, as if finally the pine cone has opened him. But Fenn is not alone in his experiments. Throughout Georgian England, the pine cone has infiltrated not only bedrooms and sick rooms, but now the realm of intellectual society. At the Royal Society of London, a heated exchange unfolds during a late summer symposium in 1787. A physician presents a paper titled "On the Influence of Arboreal Resins on the Nervous Humours of Gentle Sleep." His findings are vague but passionately delivered. He references trials in asylums, where pine oil diffused through patient quarters seemed to reduce agitation. He discusses a pine bath designed for soldiers suffering from what would later be called shell shock. He is met with polite applause and stifled laughter. A chemist stands to rebut him. The notion that trees detritus can cradle the psyche, he sneers, is sentimental nonsense. Sleep is a mechanism, not a magic trick. The crowd divides instantly, half scoffing, half leaning in, curious. And somewhere in the back row a woman, unnoticed, takes notes with a soft smile. Her name is Mrs. Beatrix Hallenby, an herbalist with no formal title, but a growing reputation among those who sleep poorly and read hungrily. She leaves the debate early. That night she places a pine cone on her writing desk and begins a manuscript titled "The Forest Breath, Notes on the Olfactory Geography of Sleep." It will never be published, but fragments will survive, and those who read them will remember how she wrote, "The cone holds not cure, but a hush, a slowing of the world that allows the soul to hear its own footsteps again." You slip now into a very different room, a madhouse on the edge of town. The year is 1794. The air is sharp with vinegar and iron. Screams echo down corridors painted to resemble gardens. It's a cruel trick, a beautiful cage. In one chamber, a young man sits by a barred window, rocking gently, eyes wide with sleeplessness. A kind nurse, her name long forgotten, brings him a pine cone. No perfume, no ribbon, just the cone. She places it in his hand. He stares at it, breathes, and for the first time in weeks, he sleeps. It will be weeks before it happens again. But it begins here, this moment, this gift, an act of absurd kindness. No one records his name, but the nurse remembers. She begins placing pine cones in other rooms. Some are thrown, some stolen, some forgotten. But one patient, a mute woman who paints in the margins of books, begins drawing pine cones in every corner of her pages. She begins to speak again. No one knows why, but it happens. Now you're in a chapel deep in Cornwall. The priest is eccentric, part philosopher, part mystic. He preaches about breath, about air as spirit. He speaks of how the pine cone formed in the highest branches absorbs light before releasing it as scent. He calls it the dreaming organ of the tree. He hangs pine cones from the rafters, one for every parishioner. They laugh at first. Then quietly they begin to report strange dreams, visions of light, of forests, of peace. Word spreads. Pilgrims come, not for relics, for pine cones. The church begins mailing them for a modest fee. It is the first known case of a pine cone ministry. The aristocrats, of course, catch wind of this. What begins as a quiet pastoral practice soon finds its way back into parlours, now tinged with the mystique of rural charm. In a twist of social irony, pine cones, once symbols of wealth, become briefly emblems of purity and rustic wisdom. Young ladies of fortune place handwritten pine cone prayers beneath their pillows. Old baronesses ask for cones to be placed in their coffins. A certain duke insists on sleeping in a bed carved entirely of pine wood with 6 cones placed around him in a celestial circle. The pine cone is no longer just a sleep aid. It is an artifact of longing, a bridge to something quieter, older, purer. Not a cure, a companion, and you. Still here, still breathing softly, still watching this centuries-long procession of hands placing cones beside the bed. From botanists to baronesses, philosophers to painters, soldiers to singers, priests to patients. You realise something. No one agrees on what the pine cone does, but everyone feels it means something. And perhaps that's the point, not the function, the faith. You find yourself now in a modern bedroom. Quiet. Moonlight spills across the floor. A phone buzzes softly on a nightstand. A book lies open, unread. And next to it a pine cone, not antique, not rare, just there. Still holding the scent of the forest, still waiting. Just as it always has. The world around you shifts again, not violently, not suddenly, but gently, like mist changing its mind. You find yourself beneath an arch of ivy and crumbling stone, the scent of damp earth thick in the air. You're in the garden of a Georgian manor just before sunrise. The hedges are clipped into fantastic shapes, peacocks and urns and mythical beasts, but you pay them no mind. Because what draws your attention isn't the garden's grandeur, but the curious gathering taking place beneath an old yew tree. 5 figures, dressed in silk and brocade, cluster around something small resting atop a marble plinth. They speak in hushed tones, not unlike worshippers or conspirators. As you near, you see it. A pine cone, placed precisely in the centre of an engraved circle, surrounded by sprigs of rosemary, sage, and lavender. This is no casual placement, it's a ritual. And this is no ordinary evening, it's the eve of the solstice when the longest night of the year begins. You are witnessing a midnight pinecone ceremony, an elite and secretive tradition among certain Georgian households, part mysticism, part medicine, and part theatre. The lady of the house, tall and draped in midnight velvet, steps forward and speaks. As breath meets bark, let sleep be whole. The others echo her words, touching their foreheads and then their hearts. One by one, they take turns inhaling the scent of the pine cone, then placing a hand on the stone, eyes closed in meditation. To a passing servant or sceptical cousin, this might look absurd, but to those within the circle, this is serious. They believe that on solstice night, the veil between worlds thins, and the pine cone, ancient, symmetrical, seeded in starlight, is a conductor, a spiritual antenna. You follow one of them home afterward, a gentleman with ink-stained cuffs and a restless manner. He doesn't sleep much. He keeps journals under his mattress, notebooks stacked in precarious towers around his room. But tonight, he carries the pine cone with both hands, as if it might shatter. He places it carefully on a velvet cloth by his bedside, sits and waits. He lights no candles. He wants the dark to fall completely. When he finally lies down, he doesn't close his eyes. He stares at the pine cone, eyes wide, breathing slow, and when sleep takes him, soft and slow like warm fog, he dreams of trees that breathe and roots that whisper in forgotten tongues. He wakes before dawn, smiling. These solstice rituals were rare, but not unheard of. In circles where esotericism met enlightenment, where astronomy bled into astrology and Newton coexisted with Nostradamus, the pine cone found a new symbolic role. It became the eye of the sleeper. In some households, small pine cone-shaped talismans were carved from ivory or bone and worn on silk cords around the neck during sleep. These were said to anchor the dreamer, preventing nightmares or spiritual drift. One aristocrat's journal from 1792 records a particularly strange belief. Dreams are rivers, pine holds the raft. Another entry, shakier, more desperate. Without my cone I float too far, I wake shaking, lost. I must stay near the tree. What was once a charming bedtime accessory had, for some, become essential. This was the era of sleep phobia. Not many speak of it now, but in the late Georgian period, a wave of fear swept through the literate classes, a fear of dying in sleep. Not the poetic, peaceful death whispered in love letters, but a terrifying sense of suffocation, of being crushed by the invisible. Doctors called it nocturnal pressure syndrome. Others simply called it the dark weight. People described waking in the middle of the night, unable to breathe, a pressure on their chest, as if something had climbed onto their ribs and was watching them. Today we'd recognise this as sleep paralysis, but then it was possession or punishment or a failure of breath, and breath, as we know, was everything. So the pinecone took on a new role, guardian. No longer just scent, no longer just status. It became a ward like a saint's icon or a protective charm. If you placed a pinecone beside your head, it would anchor your spirit, keep the lungs open, keep the air clean, keep the night at bay. In some homes, especially among the sensitive and spiritually inclined, pinecones were even named, like pets or little gods. One lady of letters referred to hers as Aegis. She wrote of speaking to it before sleep. I told Aegis today that my heart was too loud, that I feared a letter I received, that I wished to dream of water. He said nothing, but he listened. He always listens. Historians even now don't know what to do with these writings. Some say they're metaphor, others whisper madness, but in truth these pages reveal something more intimate than belief. They reveal trust in something still, something seldom, something that never judges, never interrupts, only breathes back. You now step into a quieter room, less adorned but more alive. It belongs to a carpenter in Sussex. His tools are his poetry, his hands, his sermons. He does not read the essays of philosophers or attend moonlit rituals, but every night he places a pinecone, fresh, sometimes still sticky with sap, on the windowsill by his son's crib. He doesn't explain it, doesn't theorize, just does it. The baby sleeps well, better than his brothers did, and so the pinecone stays, year after year, until the boy grows and asks why, and the father shrugs. Just feels right, he says. Sometimes that's all belief is, not inherited, not explained, just felt. You're drifting again, through parlours and bedrooms, across city blocks and rural villages. The pinecone appears again and again, always beside the bed, sometimes adorned, sometimes raw, sometimes burned in little dishes to release its scent into the air. Not too close. Resin is flammable, after all. One midwife claims it calms labouring women. A sailor sleeps with one tied into his hammock. A prisoner presses one between the bars of his window and swears it changes the way the light enters. No one agrees on its purpose, yet no one dares discard it. It has become part of the fabric, the wallpaper of sleep. And you? You stand now before a mirror holding your own pinecone, and where did you find it? Did it fall near your feet on a walk you barely remember? Or was it handed to you by a child? Or did you find it in a box tucked behind things long forgotten? No matter. What matters is that it's here, whole, unchanged, like it was in 1750, in 1350, in a Roman temple, in a forest older than the first spoken word. It remains. And now it's yours. Tonight, you set it beside your bed. Not because you're afraid, not because you believe in ancient spirits or miasmas or olfactory therapies, but because you are human, and in the stillness of sleep we all need something small, something sacred to watch over us, to remind us that breath is still with us, that sleep is not a surrender but a return, that we were never really alone, just drifting through pine-scented dark, with an ancient companion at our side. The night deepens, and with it the hush. You feel it now, not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of presence. The pinecone sits on the edge of your awareness like a small planet orbiting your sleep. It doesn't speak, it doesn't glow, but its presence feels weighty, anchoring you to something older than memory. You've seen how it passed from doctors to duchesses, mystics to mothers, but now you drift into a time when the pinecone becomes more than just ritual. It becomes fashion, science, and status, all wrapped into one polished package. You're in a drawing room in 1798. The age of revolution simmers outside, but inside the conversation is about something else entirely. The pinecone case. It is a small box no larger than a jewellery casket made of polished wood, ebony if you can afford it, lined with silk and carved with delicate spirals that echo the form of the cone it contains. These cases become the latest Georgian curiosity, coveted by collectors and gifted between lovers like sacred relics. One woman, eyes sparkling with mischief, opens her case to reveal not one but 3 miniature pine cones. Each is perfumed with a different essence: pine lavender for peace, pine cinnamon for courage, and pine rose for affection. It is not only what we dream, she purrs, but what we wish to dream. She passes the case around. Others, seated on embroidered cushions, inhale carefully, as if the dream might begin right there in the parlour. This moment might seem frivolous, even decadent, but these little pinecone cases reveal something profound. Sleep in Georgian society was no longer just a necessity. It was a performance, a mirror of class, education, and inner refinement. To sleep poorly was uncivilized. To sleep well, elegantly, silently, and preferably in a room scented with forest resin, was the mark of a person in control of both body and soul. So naturally, the pinecone became an object of design. Cabinet makers in Bath crafted intricate display trays specifically for bedtime rituals: a candle holder, a glass of lavender water, a small brush for the hair, and, nestled in a central bowl, a pinecone carved, polished, and gently perfumed. The upper classes competed subtly over the refinement of their cones. Who had imported theirs from a sacred Mediterranean grove? Whose was treated with ambergris? Whose pinecone had sat beside Voltaire himself during his final days? And yet, beneath the elegance, something very human pulsed. Everyone still needed the scent. No amount of fashion could disguise the simple, instinctive pull of that ancient aroma. It soothed the spirit like no opium or laudanum could. It didn't sedate, it reassured. You inhale now, and the scent rises again, warm, sharp, slightly sweet, like sunlit bark or forgotten altars. The pinecone had become beautiful, but it was still useful. Not everyone, of course, approved. In the medical circles of Edinburgh and Oxford, a new generation of physicians rose with sharper pens and narrower patience. They called the pinecone a rustic relic, a peasant's poultice, a bedtime placebo peddled by poets and priestesses. One particularly disdainful letter published in the Gentleman's Magazine scoffed, "Shall we next prescribe roses for rage, clouds for coughs, or tree droppings for dreams?" But even among skeptics, cracks formed. A physician named Harold Quince, who initially dismissed pinecones as botanical absurdities, later found that his own insomnia, chronic and untreatable, subsided after a pine-scented sachet was placed near his bed by a sympathetic maid. He tried it again, then again. Within weeks, he was prescribing not pine cones, he was too proud for that, but arboreal extracts. His colleagues didn't question it, because they too were sleeping better. You move now through the bedroom of a scientist, not of the body, but of the stars. Astronomer Mary Elspeth Hargrove is seated at her window, quill in hand, charting the movement of a comet. Her telescope stands beside her, but she pauses, distracted. On her desk sits a pine cone. She writes in her journal, "'Tis strange how its spirals resemble orbits, each scale a moon, each layer a season. The symmetry comforts me." Mary is no mystic. She believes in math, measurement, and momentum. Yet each night before bed, she places her cone on the windowsill and opens it slightly, turning it so the widest part faces the stars. She does not believe the cone grants her visions, but she believes it listens, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes even the most logical mind craves something to trust in the dark. Meanwhile, down the social ladder, the pine cone has become more accessible than ever. Artisans and merchants now carry bundles of them, some plain, some dipped in beeswax or pine oil, selling them to households for tuppence or less. Children begin calling them dream holders. Poorer families, unable to afford doctors, place them beside the sick as both comfort and placebo. One child is told by her grandmother, "Keep it close when you're sad. Trees remember what we forget." There is no scientific proof in that, but the girl clutches the cone during storms, during scoldings, during lonely nights, and her heart quiets. Years later, she grows up and teaches her daughter the same. The cone passes on, not as doctrine but as memory. A small pine-scented thread in the tapestry of a family. Of course, the pine cone couldn't stay trendy forever. By the dawn of the 19th century, gas lamps replaced candles, opiates became more precise, and the pine cone slowly retreated from fashionable bedrooms. But it did not disappear. In the homes of the old it remained, in corners, in drawers, wrapped in lace or linen or paper. You'd find them in trunks beside love letters and mourning ribbons. Some still held their scent, and some were dry and silent but no less respected. They were not discarded, because they were part of the night, part of sleep, part of being human. You now float through a different kind of bedroom, the kind that exists not in history but in memory, the kind that everyone has buried deep inside. Maybe it's your childhood room, maybe it's your grandmother's guest room. The floorboards creak a certain way, the air smells like something warm and wooden and faintly spiced, and in the corner, maybe on the windowsill or tucked into the folds of a forgotten blanket, sits a pine cone. You didn't question it then. You barely noticed it. But somehow it feels like it's always been there. Like it's always meant to be there. The pine cone's true power isn't in its scent or its symmetry or its spiral secrets. It's in its patience. It asks nothing of you, requires no rituals, no chanting, no sacrifice. It simply waits. It keeps you company while you drift. It holds its form while the world spins and empires fall and theories rise and fade. It watches over your breath, like it did for the aristocrats, and the mothers, and the sailors, and the dreamers. And now for you. So tonight, as the shadows soften and the air grows still, you feel it. The way your chest rises and falls, the way your thoughts slow, like leaves settling in water. And maybe, somewhere close you smell it too. That clean, steady scent, the breath of trees, the hush of pine, the scent of something that remembers and waits, always. Your eyes adjust to the dark now, not with fear, but with familiarity. This pine-scented darkness, ancient and unassuming, welcomes you in silence. The pine cone rests within reach, its spiral geometry catching the faintest shimmer of candlelight. And tonight, you travel again, through time, through breath, through slumbering halls echoing with unspoken stories. You're no longer just drifting between people. Now you step into the legacy left behind, the ripples the pine cone created not only in beds and minds, but in the very language of sleep. It's the turn of the 19th century, and you arrive in a London print shop, narrow and dusty, filled with the scent of ink and oiled wood. A man sits at a desk by the window composing a volume titled The Natural Poetics of Sleep, a companion for the gentle hour. His name is Thaddeus Vale, a minor poet of no particular renown, but his verses are unlike those of his peers, because every one of them includes a pine cone. Not metaphorically, literally. One poem begins, Let bark-bound eye bear dreaming's crown, where cone doth guard the breath's soft sound. Vale is not alone. Dozens of sleep poems from the era mention the cone, not just as a symbol, but as a physical object present during sleep. Coneward sleep, some wrote, or beneath pine's gaze. The phrase cone-blessed rest appears in pamphlets and devotional prayers. Language was shifting. The pinecone had moved beyond objecthood. It had become an idea. One editor even rejected a manuscript on grounds it lacked sufficient arboreal tranquility. Scholars still argue whether this was literary trend or spiritual fixation, but what's clear is that for a brief fragrant window in history, sleep and pine became inseparable in the written imagination. You leave the print shop behind, following words into walls, actual walls, painted not with ink but with pine. In this grand Georgian townhouse, the nursery is lined with wooden panelling carved with apple spirals. If you look closely, you see it. Each panel bears a relief of a pine cone stylized and gentle. The work of a thoughtful hand. This was intentional. A popular architectural guide from 1802 recommended the inclusion of pine ornamentation in rooms of rest for its harmonizing effect on the temperament of infants. And here, in this room, you find a child sleeping beneath a quilt stitched with trees and cones. Her breath is soft. The moonlight filters through lace curtains, and at her bedside, a real pine cone, nestled in a tiny ceramic dish. Her parents believe the pine cone holds away bad dreams. They don't remember where they heard it, but it was passed down like a lullaby, and it worked for them, so it will work for her. She stirs, murmurs something, and then breathes deeply again. The cone remains still, watching. By now you've seen the pine cone as medicine, as fashion, as talisman, and now as art. But what of its journey into the scientific household? You find yourself in a narrow university apartment, the sort reserved for unmarried lecturers and wandering scholars. Here lives Professor Elric Merton, known for his lectures on botanic acoustics, a field nobody else quite believes in. His theory? That certain plants and their byproducts subtly shape ambient frequencies in enclosed spaces, altering the brain's electrical activity. In plainer terms, he believes pine cones make rooms quieter, not just in sound, but in feeling. He builds a device, a cone harmonic isolation chamber. Inside only pine cones and sleeping volunteers. His results are inconsistent, his papers are ridiculed, but some students, those who stayed late and helped him clean up, began to ask quietly if they could keep a cone from the lab, just for their rooms, just to try. Merton, though discredited, becomes a legend. The dream listener, they call him. His old lecture notes, filled with pine drawings and soundwave scribbles, are now collector's items. He dies alone, but in his pocket they find a tiny weathered cone, still fragrant, still whole, still watching. You begin to notice a pattern now. Those who are closest to madness, to exhaustion, to loneliness, they are the ones who kept the pine cone closest. Not the loudest believers, not the trend followers, but the quiet ones, the tired ones, the ones who needed something still. And in this stillness, the pine cone seemed to respond, not like a god, not like a drug, but like a presence, a reminder that no matter how far the mind wandered, there was always a shape waiting for it at the edge of the bed. Solid, gentle, unchanging. You now find yourself aboard a ship, a merchant vessel crossing the channel in foul weather. The captain's quarters are cramped, the sea rough, but on his shelf, a pine cone, bound in leather cords, lashed in place like a relic. He doesn't pray, he doesn't dream, but he needs it there. Years ago he nearly drowned, days adrift, hallucinating from thirst until the fishing vessel found him. In his recounting of the ordeal, he said something strange. There was a smell in the air, pine, I followed it, it kept me tethered. No one believed him, but since then every voyage he carries a cone. Not for luck, not for show, but for grounding. You step off the ship now and into a museum, a quiet room lined with glass cases. One display is simple, an 18th century nightstand complete with candlestick, hand mirror, lace gloves, and a pine cone. Most pass it by, but you linger. You imagine the woman who placed it there. The number of nights she turned toward it, not expecting miracles, just comfort. And you realize this cone, preserved now behind glass, once held a living presence in someone's soft, secret hours. It once listened, like yours does now. Back in the present, you sit on the edge of your bed. The world is noisy, the night is restless. Your thoughts spiral faster than dreams can catch them. But the pine cone is there, not claiming to solve anything, just reminding you to breathe, to pause, to return to the simple truth. You are not made of machines and screens and endless scrolls. You are made of breath and memory and forest. And you, like all who came before you, are allowed to rest. Not because you've earned it, but because you are alive, and that is reason enough. The cone knows this. It holds your sleep like cupped hands hold water. Gently, steadily, as always. The pine-scented stillness clings to you now like a second skin. The air is slower here, almost syrup-thick with memory. Everything is quieter, not in volume, but in intent. And as your breath continues to soften, You find yourself standing once again in a bedroom, but this one is unlike any you've seen before. It is small, a single room tucked beneath the rafters of a modest home, the kind built not for display but for shelter. The mattress is straw, the blanket worn soft by years, a candle guttering on the shelf, and there, beside the bed, in a chipped porcelain saucer, a pine cone. No silk ribbon, no perfume, and no carved dish, just the cone. You're in the room of a war widow. Her name was Elsie Whitlow, and she lost her husband in 1806 during a distant campaign whose details blurred the moment the letter arrived. She never remarried, never moved. Her neighbours said she took to silence in her grief as if speech were an unnecessary indulgence. But what they didn't know was that every night before sleep she spoke one word, to the cone. She would place it carefully in the saucer and whisper her husband's name, Jonas. Not expecting an answer, just reminding the world that he had existed, that he had breathed, that he had once placed cones on the windowsills himself back when they were young, and he joked that the pine watched over them better than any god. Elsie never said she believed the cone did anything, but for 40 years it was the last thing she saw before her eyes closed. And when she died, the cone was still there, waiting, grief. That's what you realise now. The pine cone wasn't just for sleep, it was for grief. You drift through other bedrooms, some grand, some humble, and see the same scene play out again and again. A pine cone beside the bed of someone mourning, not always fresh, sometimes brittle, grey with the dust, but always placed with care. In the margin of a housemaid's journal from 1810, a line scrawled in uneven ink, "When I cry, it listens, when I sleep, it stays." What else do we ask from the objects we keep? Not answers, not magic, just presence. But grief is not the end of the story, it never is. Grief, in its strangest form, becomes ritual, and rituals, repeated long enough, become inheritance. You enter the nursery of a new mother, her second child barely 2 weeks old. The room smells of milk and lullabies, and on a cloth-draped table, tucked beside the rattle and the tin of balm, rests a pine cone. The mother doesn't remember when she started the habit. Perhaps it was her grandmother, perhaps it was the midwife who whispered, "Put a cone near his head, love. It'll keep the wilds out." No one in the house truly questions it. It simply is. And when the baby cries in the night and finally settles again, the mother brushes her fingers across the cone and feels, however irrationally, a small bit of steadiness return. And she doesn't believe it works, but she feels it work. And isn't that enough? From mother to child, generation to generation, the cone passes silently, not as doctrine, not as superstition, but as continuity. You arrive now in 1825 in a village schoolhouse in Derbyshire. The teacher, a quiet man with ink on his sleeves and chalk dust in his beard, is reading aloud from a book on nature. The students, drowsy in the afternoon sun, blink slowly. On the teacher's desk next to the reader's lamp rests a pine cone. Not decorative, not for the students. For him, he has trouble sleeping. His mind races at night with unfinished lessons and unpaid debts and fears about the world his students will inherit. But the pine cone helps. Its presence doesn't erase his worries. It simply reminds him that even the most ancient trees once began as something small, something silent, something like this. So when the last student leaves and the lantern is extinguished, he carries the cone home, wrapped gently in his coat pocket. Some nights it's the only thing he carries that feels like it listens. You begin to see it now, how the pine cone follows us not just through bedrooms, but through transitions, through changes, through fear. One sits in the coat pocket of a young man about to board a train for the first time. One rests on the windowsill of a girl preparing to leave for university. One is tucked into the folded hands of a woman as she lies in a hospice bed, breathing slowly, her family gathered close. No prayers are spoken, just the scent of resin, and silence, and something in the room that feels like memory, holding shape. By 1830, as industrial cities rise and soot clings to brick and sky, the pine cone begins to feel like something more than a bedtime aid. It becomes resistance. In the cramped workers' housing of Manchester and Leeds, where sleep is shallow and illness common, pine cones begin appearing again, this time in little cloth bags hung near beds, dipped in lye and pine oil to mask the smog. No one calls it science, but it's survival. A quiet stand against the unnatural rhythm of world ticking too fast. A way to say, I will breathe as trees breathe. I will sleep as forest creatures sleep. I will not surrender this small piece of wildness. Even here, even now. And just as the industrial world threatens to erase it, something unexpected happens. A new wave of naturalists, inspired by romantic poets and rural herbalists, begins cataloguing pinecone practices, not to mock, but to preserve. They write with reverence, with curiosity. They do not believe in magic, but they believe in meaning. They record the pinecone prayers, the midnight placements, the use of cones in grief, childbirth and insomnia. One scholar, Miranda Beale, writes, "Perhaps the cone has no power, but it has lineage. It contains the memory of comfort, and comfort is no small thing." She stores over 60 pine cones in her personal library, each tagged with a story. Widow in Kent, dreamer in Cornwall, sailor's boy. She never publishes her book, but her journals are found years later, tucked behind the wallboards of her home. And still today they're studied, not for the science, but for the stories. You come back now gently to your own body, to your breath, to your space. You hear the soft tick of the clock, the hum of distant traffic or wind, or nothing at all. And you remember, you too are part of this lineage. You too have a pine cone, maybe not yet, maybe only in your mind, but it waits for you, not to fix anything, not to carry your burdens, just to hold you for the night, to steady the tides inside your chest, to remind you you are still breathing, you are still worthy of rest, and you are still allowed to sleep. Because the pine has waited for centuries to share its hush, and tonight it shares it with you. The air grows even softer now, like velvet stretched thin over memory. There's a warmth blooming somewhere in your chest. Not quite joy, not quite nostalgia, but something deeper, quieter. A sense that, though centuries have passed and lives have come and gone, one small thing has remained unchanged. A pine cone, a presence. Tonight you visit one of the last Georgian manors still standing untouched by time, perched at the edge of a forest that murmurs like a sleeping god. The year is 1836. The manor is aged but proud, its stone walls stained with moss, its window latticed and dimly glowing with lamplight. Inside, the drawing room is alive with music, soft strings, careful laughter, murmured toasts. But your steps do not lead you there. No, you are drawn instead to a side hallway, lit only by flickering sconces, where the doors are closed and voices are silent. This is the wing of dreams, the part of the house reserved for rest, for secrets, for silence. You slip into a room that smells of waxed wood and lavender. A fire whispers in the hearth, barely embers now, and on a small walnut table next to a four-poster bed rests, of course, a pine cone. But this one is gilded, not entirely, just lightly, with gold leaf brushed onto the edges of each open scale. It catches the low light like a constellation mapped across bark and time. This is the bedroom of Lady Isadora Brentwell, the last in a long line of aristocrats with a peculiar fascination. The preservation of bedtime traditions. She's not asleep yet. She sits propped on embroidered pillows, reading by the light of a whale oil lamp. Her hands, though aging, are steady. Her eyes are sharp. When she sees you, or rather, when she feels your presence, for this is not a visit made in flesh, she smiles. She begins to speak aloud, though she believes she is speaking only to herself. "They laugh at me, you know," she says softly, voice crackling like the fire. "The maids, my nephew, my doctor. They say I'm mad to believe a pine cone could do anything for sleep." She closes the book. It's a volume of herbal folklore, its pages marked with slips of ribbon and pressed flowers. "But here's the thing, love. I don't need it to do anything." She leans over and brushes a single fingertip along the rim of the cone. I just need it to be here. She lies back, exhales slowly and adds, we all need something to be here. And with that, she closes her eyes. The room quiets even further, and you remain for a moment longer, watching the gold-leafed cone as it gleams like a lighthouse in the sea of sleep. As you walk the halls of her manor, past doors half closed, past generations of portraits with eyes that never quite stop watching, you notice something strange. Every bedroom has one. A cone, some plain, some perfumed, some carved with initials. One, cracked and ancient, set into a glass dome like a fossil. This house has preserved more than furniture and bloodlines. It has preserved ritual, and you begin to understand the pine cone for the Brentwell family and so many others was never just about sleep. It was about continuity. The unbroken act of placing something small and still at the edge of the bed, night after night, through sickness and health, through birth and death, through war and silence. In a world that changed faster than breath, the pine cone remained the one quiet gesture that said, you are safe now. You may let go. From the manor you drift into the pages of time, pages that flicker like candlelight, into journals, letters, margins of books. In every place you search, you begin to find traces of the pine cone. Not grand declarations, just whispers. One entry from a young servant written in cramped lines across a scrap of paper. Mrs. Ellen placed it beside my cot, said it would hush the crying dreams. I held it like a toy, but it smelled like real things, dirt, trees, summer. Another from a physician during a smallpox outbreak. No remedy but isolation, and yet I leave a cone in each sick room. Foolish, perhaps, but it steadies me. And one, barely legible, from a soldier stationed far from home. I carry one wrapped in a kerchief. It reminds me of her, not her face, but the way she made the room smell. These are not people of fame, not scientists, not nobles, but they tell the most important part of the story, the part about belief without spectacle, not religion, not superstition, just human instinct. The pine cone didn't need a doctrine, it only needed presence. And now, strangely unexpectedly, you drift into a space between time, a place not held by years or names, but by emotion, a dreamscape of rooms layered over one another, manors within tenements, palaces within huts, every kind of sleep imaginable, and in each one a pine cone, some fresh and sappy, others dry and grey, some dropped by children, some carefully positioned by hands older than the walls themselves. In this place you begin to hear them, not words, breaths, a chorus of sleeping souls, past and present, all breathing in rhythm with something ancient, something still, something pine-scented and full of memory. And as you float among them, you notice they are not lonely. Even in the dark, they are not alone, because something is always beside them, watching, listening, remembering. You're back now, not in the past, not in someone else's bed, but in your own. Maybe the room is small. Maybe the lights of the city creep through the blinds. Maybe the silence isn't total. Maybe you still hear the distant hum of machines, the occasional sigh of wind or water, or a voice through the wall. But something else is here too. A pine cone. Where did it come from, and does it matter? Maybe it was given. Maybe it was found. Maybe it was imagined. But now it's here. Its scales tight or open, depending on the air. Its scent subtle but certain. And its meaning? Yours to decide. Perhaps you keep it because it calms you. Perhaps because it reminds you of someone. Or maybe simply because in a world of noise and change and endless wanting, it is the one thing that asks nothing from you. It does not glow or buzz or alert. It simply exists. And in doing so, it gives you permission to do the same. Lady Isadora once said, as she placed her final pine cone on the nightstand before passing in her sleep, all the world changes, except this little forest eye watching us sleep. And she was right, not about the pine cone's powers, but about its promise. A promise that sleep is not abandonment, that breath, no matter how ragged, is still worthy of rhythm, and that you, soft-hearted soul that you are, deserve the company of something ancient and kind as you cross the threshold each night. So rest now. Let your thoughts curl like bark. Let your limbs soften like moss. Let your chest rise and fall like wind through pines. The cone is here. It always has been. It always will be. You're floating now, suspended between memory and sleep. The pine-scented hush is so deep it seems to hold time still, like dust in a sunbeam that never settles. You're no longer simply visiting moments. You're drifting through the soul of something bigger than ritual, older than tradition. And you begin to wonder, why the pine cone? Why this simple object? You drift through forest canopies, high above the chaos of empires, revolutions and bedtime rituals. The trees that bore these cones rise like cathedrals, Scots pine, stone pine, white pine. You pass through their crowns into groves that seem untouched by human feet, listening not to words but to design. The spiral, that sacred geometry, the Fibonacci sequence coded into each scale of the cone, nature's mathematics, hidden in plain sight. Some say the pine cone is the first language of the forest. Others call it the eye of the tree, always open, always watching. It grows slowly, patiently. It closes tight against the cold, then opens gently to the promise of heat. It adapts, but never rushes. It holds seeds not just of more trees, but of entire ecosystems. And for centuries that slow unfolding echoed something very human. The opening of the soul during sleep, the readiness to let go, to soften, to trust the dark. That's why perhaps the Georgian world and all its fluttering excess still return to the pine cone. Because it was the one part of nature that mirrored their need without mocking it. Silent, steady, whole. You land again, back in the 1830s, this time in a country chapel in Wales. Not a home, not a bedroom, but a place of stillness just the same. A priest stands at the pulpit, delivering a funeral eulogy for a young mother. His voice trembles, not because he doubts his words, but because he's known her since she was a girl. When the service ends, mourners approach the coffin. Flowers are placed, whispered prayers float upward, and then a child steps forward. He places something small on the closed lid, a pine cone. The room doesn't stir, no one speaks, but the priest watches, and he weeps. Later he will write in his diary, "We speak of the soul as ascending, but the boy knew better. He gave her something from the ground, something real, something that listens. That cone, collected quietly after the service, will be placed in the church's vestry, wrapped in linen, and labelled only with her initials. Decades later, someone will find it. They will not know why it's there, but they will not throw it away, and so it goes. Through homes and halls, through temples and trunks, the pine cone becomes not just part of the furniture, but part of the human rhythm. Wherever people have dared to lie down and surrender their waking lives, it has crept in, quietly like moss on stone. In a London boarding house in 1841, an orphan girl sleeps curled around a cone she found in the park. She calls it Poppy and refuses to sleep without it tucked in the crook of her elbow. The mistress of the house frowns at such foolishness until the girl's nightmares stop. In a Scottish monastery, one monk places a cone on each pillow after evening prayers. The abbot never asks why. He simply notices the younger monks rise calmer, quieter. In the high fields of Yorkshire, a midwife ties a pine cone with blue thread and hangs it from the rafters before each birth. She says nothing to the families, but she never forgets. You wonder, did everyone believe in the pine cone's power? Of course not, but belief was never the point. The pine cone was not a cure, it was not even a solution. It was a signal that someone had placed it there, that someone had cared enough to mark the night, to acknowledge the vulnerability of sleep, the way we disappear and hope to return. It was a way to say you matter, even now, even here, even in your rest. Isn't that all we ever want? Not to be protected by gods or guarded by science, but simply noticed, witnessed, held without hands. The pinecone offered that, without ever asking for worship. You find yourself now in a cottage in Cornwall, 1848. A storm claws at the shutters. Inside, 3 generations huddle near the hearth. The grandmother, her back curved like a question mark, tells the children a story. How once, she says, voice like smoke, when the world was young, people slept under the stars, and the trees were alive in a different way. They whispered to each other, they watched over the sleepers, and when the people began to build walls and doors and forgot how to listen, the trees left them a gift. She reaches into a pouch and produces a pine cone. This, she says, is the eye of the forest. It never blinks. It never sleeps. It remembers when we could dream without fear. The children gasp. Later that night, each child sleeps with a cone under their pillow. Whether they believe or not is irrelevant. They sleep well. We try so hard to explain sleep, to tame it. We invent rituals, candles, teas, pills, apps. But sometimes the oldest comforts require no explanation. They simply work because they carry the memory of thousands of nights before. The pine cone does not sedate you. It does not diagnose or correct. It only does what it has always done. It waits. Quietly, softly, endlessly. Now you are in the archives of a natural history museum deep beneath London. Among dusty shelves and boxes labelled in faded ink sits a wooden crate. Inside, dozens of preserved cones. Some split, some closed tight. One, unusually large, is wrapped in a swatch of velvet. A note is pinned beside it. Found on the bedside table of Arthur Devlin, poet, deceased 1851. Said to have brought him peace during his final years. There's no record of Arthur Devlin's fame. His poetry never crossed the channel. But someone kept his cone, not for study, not for display, but for memory. It is still faintly fragrant. You inhale, and in that scent there is no death, only continuity. Back in the present, you remember the first time you touched a pine cone. Maybe it was rough in your palm, maybe it smelled sharp and foreign. You probably didn't think about sleep then, but now you see what it has always offered. Stillness, grounding, a point of quiet in a loud and racing world. Not a cure, not a command, just a gentle invitation. Come back to breath, come back to softness, come back to sleep. The pine cone is not ancient because it is old. It is ancient because it has never needed to change. Its spiral still sings the same geometry. Its scent still stirs the same instinct. Its presence still says, I am here, and so are you, and that is enough. So tonight, when the world grows heavy again, and your body asks for rest, you know what to do. You place the pine cone beside you, not with ceremony, just with care, and you breathe, and you let the darkness return not as an enemy but as an embrace. The trees are still whispering, and the pine cone still listens. Sleep draws closer now, like the tide returning to shore after a long, slow breath. You feel the familiar weightlessness that comes not from floating but from letting go. The pine cone rests beside you unchanged, just as it has rested beside thousands before you, watching, waiting, whispering. But now the story shifts again. This time you're no longer in the grand homes of Georgian aristocrats or the stone cottages of quiet villages. Now you're stepping into the twilight of the era, where gaslight begins to replace candlelight, where railroads carve through ancient woods, and where science begins to push harder against the borders of belief. It's 1855, and you're standing in a shop that smells like ink, pine tar and leather bindings, a small cluttered bookseller's tucked between 2 city blocks in London. There, you find a strange little volume bound in green cloth, its title printed in gold leaf, The Nighttime Practices of the Cultured Mind. The author is anonymous. The text is peculiar. Inside are instructions, not on how to read or write, but how to sleep with intention. Each chapter outlines methods inspired by classical philosophy, astrology, and herbal knowledge. But one chapter stands out, the pine cone principle. The author writes, place it at the western side of your pillow. Do not speak to it, but let it absorb. Sleep with your breath as slow as dripping wax, and do not remove the cone until sunrise or all stillness may spill. It's dramatic, possibly nonsense, but you smile, because even now someone was trying to preserve the ritual, to keep it alive, even as the modern world marched on with factories and telegrams and factories pumping out tiny clocks that ticked too fast for dreams to keep up. And somewhere in that tiny shop, a young woman buys the book. She is not rich, she is not noble, but she reads that page and tucks a pine cone beside her own pillow that night, because something in her wants to believe, even just a little, that something ancient still holds space for her sleep. Belief is strange, isn't it? Not in gods, not in systems, but in small private things, in the talismans we choose when no one is watching. A pine cone placed gently becomes a form of invisible resistance, a refusal to let the cold steel of industrial modernity strip us of every softness. In the boarding houses of early Victorian England, nurses begin keeping them in their aprons, not for scent, not for prayer, just because the wards are full and the hours are long and something about carrying a piece of the forest reminds them of air not thick with bleach. They never speak of it, but the cones are passed quietly from one pocket to another, especially to the younger nurses, the ones still shaky after the first death. One writes in a letter home, "It's not for sleep, really. It's just something old, something quiet. I keep it next to the cot. It smells like the world before noise." Now you're gliding through a sanatorium in the countryside. The year is 1863. The place is bright, unusually airy, filled with the scent of soap, thyme, and lavender. You follow a physician named Julian Merrow, a man more poet than doctor, though his lab coat and calm hands earn him credibility. He believes in light therapy, in walking barefoot in grass, in the healing power of warm silence, and he believes in pine cones. In each patient's room, by his order, sits a simple white saucer containing one. No two the same. Some he finds during his morning walks. Others are brought to him by the recovering, those well enough to roam the gardens. To Dr. Merrow, the pine cone is more than symbolic. He believes truly quietly that it absorbs excess worry, that its spiral pulls anxiety into itself scale by scale. He never lectures about it. He simply leaves them with a note that reads, "For a steadier breath." Some patients scoff, others ignore it, but some, those who lie awake at 3 a.m, unable to silence the tremble inside their chest, begin to reach for it. Not to pray, just to touch, and that touch helps, even if only because it's something real, something solid, something from a place where sleep is still sacred. You find yourself now inside a children's hospital. The halls are whitewashed, the windows wide. Here in the paediatric ward, the nurses have begun making cone dolls, small pine cones dressed in scraps of cloth, with little yarn faces stitched on. At first it's a distraction, a craft, but then the children begin to sleep better. They tuck the dolls beside their cheeks. They whisper secrets to them. They call them names like Piney, Miss Cone, or Captain Sleep. They pretend they're forest guardians who stand watch during the long nights when fevers rise or dreams turn sour. A child with consumption writes, "She doesn't talk, my doll, but she stays. She never goes when it's dark." These dolls begin to appear in more wards, more homes. They aren't marketed, they aren't sold, they just spread. Like lullabies passed from room to room, the world outside is growing louder, faster. Trains scream, cities swell, electricity creeps into homes. The idea of a pine cone on a nightstand begins to feel to some like a relic. But even now, in the great homes and the tiny rooms, people keep them. Not out of obligation, out of instinct. One woman in Manchester keeps hers in a drawer filled with old letters and dried roses. She never takes it out, but once a year, on the anniversary of her husband's death, she opens the drawer, breathes deeply, and closes it again. A boy in Edinburgh carves faces into them and leaves them in windowsills, so the house doesn't get lonely while we sleep. A maid in Brighton leaves one at the foot of each guest bed she makes, not because she's told to, but because it feels right, like a signature. Even as society moves forward, The pine cone lingers, not as medicine or magic or myth, but as memory. And now, gently, you arrive in the home of someone not unlike you. Perhaps it is you. The year is unclear, mid-century perhaps. The room is modest, a few books, a lamp, a bed, and a pine cone. It isn't glamorous, it isn't gold-leafed, but it's clean. Resting in a small dish placed with quiet care, you lie on the bed and gaze at it, and in it you see everything. The hands that gathered it, the children who held it like a guardian, the grief it absorbed, the dreams it witnessed, the breath it followed, night after night. It says nothing, but it offers you what no machine or ritual can, a place to begin sleep without needing to justify your weariness. You're allowed to rest, because you are human, because the night belongs to you, because the forest in its ancient spiral still remembers what your world forgets. The hush deepens now. You're closer to sleep than ever. Not just any sleep. This is the kind that descends with ancient roots, with centuries of breath folded gently into its arms. The pine cone remains by your side, still and open, like a door that never needed hinges. And in the silence you begin to understand that your story is not separate from the ones you've seen. It is woven into the same spiral, scale by scale. You drift again, weightless, into the threshold between centuries. The year is 1873, a small private residence in Bath, England. The household belongs to a widowed schoolteacher named Frances Alden. She lives alone except for a grey cat and an oil painting of her younger self with her sister. Gone now, many winters past. Every morning she takes a walk through the garden behind her home, even when the frost paints the hedgerows white. She collects herbs, touches leaves, listens to the birds, and once a week she gathers pine cones, not to burn, not to decorate, but to clean. She wipes each one with a cloth soaked in diluted vinegar, then rubs them with beeswax. She polishes them like silver. She places them on every windowsill in the house. Visitors find it odd. Some assume it's an eccentric habit. But those who stay the night, they understand, because there is a peace in her home that feels older than wallpaper and carpet, a quiet that settles into your bones. Each room hums with a presence you can't quite name, and at the centre of her bedroom, always, on the left corner of her pillow, is a small oiled pine cone. Not perfumed, not gold-plated, just whole. When she sleeps, she holds it in her palm loosely, and when she wakes, she places it on her pillow again, like a bookmark in a dream. She once wrote in her journal, "A pine cone keeps no time, and so I keep mine so that something in this house might stay unafraid of the dark." That journal years later would be found inside a locked drawer, alongside a fresh pine cone, still fragrant, still unwilted. Across the country, the Victorian age blooms louder, steam-powered, soot-coloured, mechanical. People are fascinated with ghosts, mesmerised by séances, and obsessed with categorising the soul. And amid all this spiritual frenzy, the pine cone quietly survives. It is not grand, it does not promise to raise the dead. But in homes where mourning crape still drapes over door frames, the cone becomes a kind of mourner's relic. A little girl whose mother passed away during childbirth places one under her pillow for years. She never tells her father why, but when she marries and moves away, the pine cone comes with her, wrapped in linen, stitched into the corner of her trousseau chest. Her daughter will sleep with the same cone during her first years of school, and her granddaughter later will carry one in her pocket when crossing the Atlantic. The pine cone becomes not just a sleep aid, but a memory seed. People begin placing them in their travel trunks, soldiers tuck them into coat linings, seamstresses stitch them into pillows. In a sewing circle in Bristol, a group of women embroider little cloth pouches, each holding a single dried cone and a sprig of heather. They exchange them like friendship tokens. In one letter from 1884, a woman writes to her cousin, "I don't sleep well since Charles left, but I have the pine you gave me. It smells like your garden, like we're still children." The pine cone by now isn't tied to science, or wealth, or fashion. It's tied to the ordinary sacred, to the kind of quiet gesture that echoes deeper than any explanation. And yet not everyone embraces it. By the late 1800s, the rationalist movement is in full swing. Sleep hygiene becomes the new buzz. Doctors recommend firm mattresses, controlled lighting, no emotional stimuli before bed. Aromatherapy and herbal law are pushed aside in favour of things measured and tested, and the pinecone becomes quaint, obsolete, even mocked. In one 1889 pamphlet titled Modern Solutions to Nervous Complaints, a footnote reads, "The absurd practice of sleeping beside botanical curios, pine cones, rose bulbs, dried moss, is a vestige of peasant superstition and should be discouraged in households striving for intellectual advancement." But people don't stop, they just go quieter. A cone tucked in a drawer, under the mattress, in a sock, doesn't need to be seen, it only needs to be there. In a boarding school in Sussex, a girl hides her pine cone in a shoebox beneath her bed. Her roommate finds it and teases her for a week, but the girl doesn't care, because when the wind howls at night and the windows rattle in their frames, she clutches that cone like a secret. In a workhouse dormitory, a young boy who has nothing, no parents, no possessions, no shoes, finds one in the alley behind the building. He takes it, dries it by the fire, and places it under the scratchy blanket that covers his cot. That cone is the only thing that never gets stolen. Even the older boys leave it alone. They don't know why, but they respect it. And then something remarkable begins to happen. People start writing about it again. Not in medical journals, but in stories, in poems, in quiet little essays buried in the back of literary magazines. A Welsh writer pens a tale called The Night Watcher, in which a pine cone placed beside a child's bed protects him from sorrow, not by fighting it, but by absorbing it. A columnist in a London daily recalls sleeping in his grandmother's house during a fever and waking to find a pine cone pressed gently into his hand by someone who had passed away years before. These stories, though small, keep the memory alive. The cone no longer needs defenders. It lives now in imagination, in metaphor, but also, still, on nightstands. And where is the pine cone in your own story? Perhaps you have one near you now, something you picked up on a walk, not knowing why. Something dry and brown and spiraled. Something that fits in your palm like it was always meant to be there. You don't need to believe in it. You don't need to explain it. But maybe, just maybe, you keep it because part of you still wants to believe that some objects care, or at least that they remember the hands that held them. And in a world that forgets so quickly, that kind of remembering is everything. You drift now into a chapel, small and windowless. The candles have burned low. The last worshipper has gone, but near the altar, left quietly on a prayer bench, is a pine cone wrapped in red thread. No one claims it, no one moves it, and still it stays, night after night, as if listening to the silence left behind by prayers not yet answered. Because some nights, even God might need a moment to rest. And the pine cone, loyal as ever, waits. This is what the Georgians understood. Beneath the powder and perfume and velvet, beneath the rituals and manners and silver spoons, they knew what it meant to feel small in the dark. And they chose something that made them feel a little less alone. Not because it was powerful, but because it was constant. You feel that constancy now, right beside you. Inhale, and there it is, resin, bark, wind, age. Exhale, and you feel it again, stillness, warmth, memory, sleep. It doesn't matter what year it is, or where you are. The pinecone remains. Sleep is close now, so close that even thought feels like a whisper curled around a candle's flicker. But there's still one last breath to take, one last step to make in this long, pine-scented journey. You've wandered through centuries, cradled traditions, brushed fingers across memory, and now, here, you arrive at the threshold of the present. It's the year 1900. The Victorian age is preparing to fold into the Edwardian. The world is exhaling again, shifting its shoulders, bracing for the electricity of a new century. But somewhere on the edge of a quiet northern village, Wensley it's called, there is a modest cottage made of sun-warmed stone, its windows rimmed with frost and its chimney lazily sighing smoke into the dusk. Inside that home, a woman named Agnes Miller prepares for bed. She's not aristocracy, not a healer, Not a mystic, just a school librarian retired. Her fingers ache in winter. Her hair has turned the colour of old newspaper. And tonight, like every night, she places a pine cone on her nightstand, then folds her hands over the blanket and waits for the stillness to take her. But tonight, she's writing something. A letter. To her grandson in London. The letter is not long. You ask me why I keep it by my bed. The pine cone. I've thought about it, and here is my best answer. Because when the world is quiet, it helps me remember that I too am part of the trees. That sleep is not an ending. Only a kind of leaf fall. And come morning, the forest always returns, so I keep it there as proof. For me, for you, for anyone who ever needs reminding. She finishes the letter, seals it with wax, and places the pine cone atop it like a paperweight, though she knows the boy will never see that moment. She sleeps well that night, and when the letter arrives days later, the boy reads it sitting by a train window, the city already disappearing behind him. He smiles, and though he tells no one, he stops at a park that afternoon and finds a cone of his own. He keeps it in his coat pocket for years. From there, the century unspools rapidly. World wars, electricity, movies, airplanes, television, phones, and still the pine cone survives. Sometimes hidden, sometimes visible, sometimes mistaken for a decoration, a seasonal flair. But for those who know, it is more. In the trenches of World War I, soldiers write home asking their wives or mothers to send something small from home. More than one of those packages contains a pine cone, sometimes wrapped in ribbon, sometimes with a note, so you sleep safer. In bomb shelters during the Blitz, mothers place pine cones near the sleeping heads of their children, not because it will stop the sirens, but because it's something solid to touch, something from the world before noise. In 1957, an author writes a children's book about a magical pine cone who guides children through dreams. It becomes quietly beloved, not a bestseller, but the kind of book that lives on in second-hand stores, gifted between generations. And in 1982, an elderly woman gives her granddaughter a dried cone in a little box and says, "Keep this with you in case you ever feel too far from yourself." The girl laughs, but she keeps it anyway. She still has it. It now rests on the corner of her writing desk, next to a half-burned candle and a mug of tea she always forgets to finish. She's writing a bedtime story, you see, about pine cones, and sleep and memory. And then we arrive, now, the modern room. Maybe you're in a city with light leaking in through the blinds. Maybe it's rural and the only sound is wind. Maybe your room is cluttered, or empty. Maybe your mind is restless tonight. Tired but yes, busy, filled with thoughts that won't quiet. Or maybe you've already begun to drift, eyes fluttering, chest softening. Wherever you are, this is your moment, the one all the others led to, because here, tonight, the pine cone has made its way into your world, by story, by memory, by inaction. It is beside you now, on your table, in your hand, or maybe just in your mind, but it is there, and that means you're not alone. You see, the pine cone never asked for belief, only presence, and you've given it that. In doing so, you've joined a quiet lineage, one that stretches across centuries, through palaces and huts, through grief and comfort, through sleep and waking. You're part of that now, when you breathe slowly, when you surrender to rest. You continue something sacred, something that never needed a name, just a breath, just a pause, just this. And if you listen closely now in these final moments before sleep, if you tune your ears not to the clock or the room, but to the world beneath the world, you'll hear it. A sound like wind through pine needles, a sound like breath being remembered, a sound like 1,000 whispered thank yous, folded inside the scales of a single cone. This is your inheritance. This is your hush. This is your place at the edge of the spiral. So place your cone or its memory. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your eyelids fall. The forest is watching, and it says, you may rest now. And now your journey is complete. You've walked through time softly, gently, following the slow rhythm of breath, memory, and pine. You've seen the bedrooms of Georgian aristocrats in the hands of those who came long after. You've touched centuries without ever needing to rush, and now there's nowhere else you need to be. So let yourself settle, let your limbs grow heavier, like branches weighed with quiet snow. Let the images fade, golden pine cones, flickering candlelight, the hush of chapels and the whisper of forest winds. Everything can wait. The world, in all its noise and urgency, will still be here when you return. But for now, you're safe in the in-between. The pine cone still rests beside you, whether truly, physically, or simply in spirit. It doesn't matter. Its presence is enough. Breathe in slowly, feel the air fill your chest like a tide. Breathe out even slower. Let it carry away the last edges of wakefulness. There's no need to remember every detail of what you heard tonight. That's the beauty of old stories. They settle inside you whether or not you hold on to them, like seeds, like pine cones. All that matters now is this stillness. You're exactly where you need to be, exactly as you are. So close your eyes, let your thoughts melt into the dark like ink in warm water. Let your breath be the only sound that matters. And if in your dreams you find yourself walking a quiet path beneath tall, watchful trees, remember you're not lost, you're home. Good night, dear dreamer, and sleep deeply.